Okay, this has to be the closest I've ever come to actual gardening. Hi guys, welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, it's great to meet you. I'm Stella, and I love making miniatures for my Barbie dollhouse using mostly cardstock. In today's video, I'll show you how I made this miniature set of gardening tools, and as always, I'll have free printables and templates to help you make your own version. All the infos and the download link are in the video, so let's begin. To make a tiny little trowel, I cut these parts and stacked them from the biggest to the smallest. Now, I usually recommend repurposing cardstock from old packaging for my projects, since it's sturdy, easy to cut, and basically free. But for this project, I chose a lighter weight cardstock because all the pieces are so tiny, and this makes it way easier for my cutting machine to get clean cuts. And if you're using my free printable template, cutting the heart-shaped hole might be challenging, so it'll probably be easier to simply pierce a small circle with an awl instead. I repeated the step to make another identical piece. Then I assembled the two parts to make the handle of my little trowel, which measures around 2 millimeters. Next, I spread a bit of spackling paste over the sides of the handle to make them appear smoother. And here you can see the difference between the treated and untreated sides. Now, in order to fake a wood finish, I started by covering the handle with a layer of acrylic gesso applied with a brush. This helps creating a sort of wood grain-like texture, as you can see here. Then I colored the handle with brown acrylic paint, diluted with quite a lot of water. To make the blade of the trowel, I cut this part and I glued all the layers together. The end piece was just a little over 1 millimeter in thickness. Next I cut this part, attached the two sides together, and then I pressed an awl against the center of the blade to give it a slightly curved shape. Finally, I assembled the two elements like this. Just as I did for the handle, I coated the blade with acrylic gesso, but this time I applied it with a makeup sponge. Next, I painted the blade in a cute baby blue shade because I really like the combination of pastel colors and wood. Once the paint was dry, I glued the handle and the blade together. Next, I decided to give the trowel a bit of a shiny finish by coating it with a clear gloss varnish. I used a paintbrush for the handle and a Q-tip for the blade to achieve a sort of uneven finish. To make a tiny rake, I prepared another handle identical to the one I made for the trowel. Then I cut this part and glued all the pieces together. Next, I cut this part and sandwiched it between these two. Lastly, I bent all the little prongs like this. I assembled these two pieces together. Then, just as I did for the trowel, I painted the rake with acrylic gesso first, and then with acrylic paint. I attached the head to the handle. Then I coated them with a light layer of clear gloss varnish. And once again I used a paintbrush for the handle and a Q-tip for the head. To make a little garden fork, I started by cutting these parts and then I attached them together, going from the biggest to the smallest. I repeated the process to make a second identical piece, then I assembled the two sides together to create another handle. And just a reminder, if you have a Cricut or a Silhouette cutting machine, you can use my digital templates, which you can find in my shop linked in the description box. Yet again, I used a bit of spackle to smooth out the edges. Then I covered the handle with acrylic gesso and acrylic paint to mimic a wood finish. Next I cut this part and attached the three layers together. The final piece was roughly 1 millimeter thick. Then I cut this part, glued the two sides together, and finally attached them to that tiny piece I prepared earlier. I coated the finished piece with acrylic gesso and acrylic paint. And lastly, I attached it to the handle. Finally, I coated everything with a faint layer of clear varnish. To make a second smaller trowel, I made another small handle, then I cut this part and attached the layers together. Then I cut this, glued together the two parts. And finally I sort of pinched the left and right sides to give the blade a somewhat curved shape. I assembled the blade and then I covered it with acrylic gesso and acrylic paint. And I guess by now you know the drill. I attached the handle to the blade and then I coated the entire piece with a light touch of clear varnish. Now, if you've been following this channel, you probably know that this is the year I became obsessed with making miniature packaging, so here we are. I started by cutting this part into cardstock, then I covered its cutout window with a piece of clear plastic from an old plastic packaging. And finally, I folded all the sides of the template like this. And I used craft cardstock for the packaging because I think it really fits the whole eco-friendly gardening theme. I'll have it linked in the description, along with all the other supplies I used for this project if you wanna get it. Although you could also use cardstock from recycled packaging as long as you peel off the printed layer. I glued the tabs to create a little box. Then I printed and cut all these labels and I glued them to the packaging this way. Finally, I cut this part into a piece of lightweight cardstock, painted with alcohol markers to match the color of the gardening tools. To fix the tools to this base, I used a piece of elastic thread, the kind used for jewelry making. You could use regular sewing thread in its place, however, elastic thread makes it a lot easier to move the tools in and out of their packaging, so I personally prefer to use that. To make a pair of miniature gardening shears, I started by cutting this part into metallic cardstock. And if you don't feel like buying it, you can often find it in food packaging, which is where mine comes from. I glued the two sides together this way, then I cut this part, and once again I glued the two layers together. I repeated the same step for this part. Then I assembled the three elements like this. I painted the handle in a light blue color. Then I repeated the whole process to make a second identical piece. To assemble the scissors, I used a flathead jewelry pin. I trimmed the pin and then I fixed it in place with a drop of UV resin. You can also use wet glue for this. To make the second type of shears, I cut this part into metallic cardstock and I glued the two sides together. I repeated the same step for this part. And then for these two, which I made it twice. I assembled the two sides of the shears like this. Then I painted the handles and yet again I used a jewelry pin to connect the blades. And at this point I decided that I didn't like the matte finish on the handles, so I coated them with nail polish to make them look a bit glossier. To make a packaging for my tiny shears, I cut this part and folded it in half. Then I embellished it with these labels. Once again, I used elastic thread to fix the scissors to the packaging. And then I closed it using this little tab at the bottom. I repeated the same process to make a packaging for the second pair of shears. To make a miniature watering can, I cut this part into lightweight cardstock. Then I pressed it against a wet sponge to make it softer and a little more malleable before rolling it against a paintbrush to give it a nice curved shape. I glued the ends to create this sort of half cone. Then I cut this circle 3 times and attach the layers together like this. I glue the resulting piece to the part I cut earlier this way. Next, I cut this part, and once again I dampened it with water and rolled it against the paintbrush to make it a little rounded. Then I glued it to the watering can's base, aligned at the bottom this way. To make the top, I cut this little ring 3 times, glued the sides together, and finally I attached it to the rest of the structure. To make the spout, I cut this part and pressed it against the same wet sponge as before, and then I rolled it against a small paintbrush to shape it. I glued the ends together to form a little tube. Then I cut this part, assembled the 3 layers together, and finally I attached them to the narrower end of the spout like this. I glued the spout to the body of the watering can. Then I cut this part a bunch of times and glued all the layers together to make the handle of my watering can. And just like I did for the milk jugs I showed you in my last video, I waited to attach the handle to the rest of the watering can to simplify the painting process. For starters, I covered both pieces with acrylic gesso. Then I painted the handle, the lower half of the body, and the spout in a light blue shade. Next, I use a fine marker to paint the holes on the spout black. I think this makes them look a little more realistic. I attached the handle to the watering can. Then I covered all the blue areas with clear nail polish to make them shiny. And our miniature set of gardening tools is ready. As promised, here's a link to the free printable templates, and if you want to experiment making some mini plants for your dollhouse, you may enjoy watching this video next. And this is all for today. Until next time, bye!